And let's now take a look at the solutions to the Matplotlib practice questions and activities that we looked at in the last lecture. I hope you got on okay with those, but for any questions that you weren't able to answer, then we'll go through and explain all of these solutions now. Let's move on over into Jupyter Notebook and take a look at what we needed to do for each of these questions. Okay, and here we are now inside of the Matplotlib Activities Lecture Notebook. I'll just go ahead and run these two cells at the top to import NumPy and Pandas, as well as generate our data. And then for our first question, let's go ahead and import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT, which the question kind of gave the answer to anyway. And then we'll go ahead and set Matplotlib to be in line, like so. For activity 1, we needed to create a basic plot for our months and sales 1 figures by using plt.plot, as well as specifying a custom marker and setting the labels and titles. This is the functional approach to Matplotlib. So to plot our data, we could have gone ahead and typed in plt.plot and then pass in our months and sales 1 data lists, which will then plot our data. To set a custom marker, we could just pass in the marker argument, and then this could be any of the marker options that we saw on the Matplotlib documentation page. I'll pass in an O to create some small circle markers. And okay, this is perfect. To add in our labels, as it says in one of the hints, we can use plt.xlabel, plt.ylabel, and finally plt.title. I'll put these in here at the bottom. So plt.xlabel, and this will be our months. Our Y label will be the sales amount in dollars, and then our title will just be monthly sales. Next up, for activity 2, we had a couple of questions on subplots. For the first of these, I asked you to create a figure with 2 subplots, with 1 row and 2 columns. So now we're moving on to a more object-oriented approach by creating a figure object and then plotting our axes on it. To create our subplot, as we looked at before, we need to create our figure and axes at the start. So I'll go ahead and say fig, axes, and then this will be equal to plt.subplots. And then to change the number of subplots created, we can use the nRows and ncols arguments. So I'll say that nRows, or our number of rows, is equal to 1, and then our ncols, or number of columns, is equal to 2. Checking the output of this matches what we had for our example before. To plot data onto our specific subplots, we can use indexing. So to plot data onto our first subplot, we could index our axes at the first position, which is index 0 because of zero-based indexing. And then we can call the plot method on this to plot our months and sales 1 data, like so. And I'll also pass in the color argument and set this to green, as well as setting a custom marker and changing the line style to be dashed. And now we have our data plotted onto the first subplot of this axis. To plot our sales 2 data onto our second subplot, we can use the same code as above, but we'll just need to change the index and the data that it's using. So I'll copy this code from here, and then just add in the extra code for our second plot, which I'll call on index 1 of the axes, and then I'll also change the color of this to be blue and the line style so that it's not dashed. You might have noticed here though that our x-axis labels are completely overlapping each other, which makes it pretty hard to pick out what each label says. To fix this, I asked you to increase the figure size, but we could also have changed the orientation of our x-tick labels, which is something that we looked at before. To increase the figure size, we could have simply passed in the fig size argument into our subplots function. So I'll just add this in here at the end, and then in the instruction for this question, it says to pass in 16 and 6, which will be for our width and height respectively. So we'll just pass these values in inside of a tuple, and that'll make our figure much larger. So there's now a lot more space for each of our plots, and our labels are now clearly visible. Okay, and moving on to activity 3. This one was on how to edit the appearance and styling of our graphs or plots. I provided you with this code for a basic unformatted plot, and then asked you to turn it into this second formatted version below by using the color, line style, line width, marker, marker size, and label arguments. I'll go ahead and copy this code down to our next cell, and then I'll add in the required arguments. Starting with the color, we can see that the color of our example chart is green, so I'll say that color is equal to G, and then the line style of this is dashed, so hopefully you remembered that we can use a double hyphen to set this line style. And then for our line width, I actually provided the answer for this, which was 2, as this one would have been hard to get an exact match on. For our markers, I had these set as O again, and then I just changed the marker size to be 10, which is another one where I provided the correct answer. And finally, for our label, we can see that from the legend in our example below, this was the sales data. To display our legend, we then just needed to add in the plt.legend function, which I'll do here at the bottom. So I've clearly made a mistake here somewhere. The issue is that I missed the comma after the sales1 variable for the y-axis. So if I just add a comma in here and then run this, that'll work fine. Nice one. And that there matches the example perfectly. Moving on to our final activity, this was on creating different graph types. So a bar chart, histogram, and scatter plot. And then at the bottom here, I mentioned just to use sales1 for the data. But if you used sales2, then it doesn't really matter. That was mainly just so that the outputs matched. For this activity, I'll use the functional approach, but if you used the object-oriented approach by creating figure objects and then calling plot methods on them, then that would be even better. But starting with our bar chart, we can just go ahead and say plt.bar and then pass in our first argument, which is our x-axis. So I'll set this to be our months list. And then for our y-axis, or height, I'll set this to be our sales1 list, which again is just the actual data or values that we want to plot. And then for the colours, this was teal with an edge colour of black, but the colours here don't really matter. The important thing was to create the plot itself. And then at the bottom here, we could also have added in the labels and title, which I'll just go ahead and fast forward and add these in. For our histogram, this was quite a simple one. So plt.hist and then we'll pass in our sales 1 data. Looking at the example below, I set a custom color, which was sky blue, as well as a black edge color. But again, if you didn't get the color of this exactly, then that doesn't matter at all. Sky blue is just one of the CSS color options, but no one really bothers to remember these, so don't worry about the colors too much. And then while I was talking there, I just added in our labels and titles too. The last plot for this activity was a scatter plot, which we can create with plt.scatter. We'll have our months along the x-axis, and then again we'll have our sales 1 data on the y-axis. For the customization, the color was just green, and then I had the marker set as a star or asterisk. Before we run this, I'll just fast forward again and add in our title and labels to this. Okay, and great job there. That's it for this section. I hope these activities helped you to understand and remember the syntax for Matplotlib. It can be quite a difficult library to learn initially, but the main things to remember are that unless you're creating a very simple one-off plot, it's better to use the object-oriented approach, which just involves creating a figure object and set of axes, and then plotting data onto that set of axes. If any of these questions were unclear or don't make sense to you, then please go ahead and either review the solutions or theory lectures, or post your question down in the Q&A section below. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you all in the next section, where we'll begin looking at Seaborn.